In the emerald heart of Southeast Asia, where the Mekong River winds through ancient rice paddies and dense tropical forests, a nation called Vietnam had known the weight of foreign rule for nearly a century. The year was 1863 when French gunboats first forced their way up the muddy waters of the Saigon River, bringing with them the machinery of colonial empire. What began as a quest for trade routes and Catholic missions would evolve into something far more consuming, a system that would extract rubber, rice, and human dignity from a land that had resisted Chinese armies for over 1,000 years. The French called their prize Indochine, a sweeping territory that encompassed not only Vietnam, but also the kingdoms of Cambodia and Laos. They built grand boulevards in Saigon and Hanoi, planted rubber trees in endless rows, and established a colonial administration that ruled through a careful blend of local puppet rulers and French bureaucrats. The Vietnamese people found themselves strangers in their own homeland, forbidden from gathering in groups, required to carry identity papers, and forced to bow before foreign masters who spoke a language as alien to them as the humid winds of the monsoon were familiar. French engineers carved railways through mountain passes, connecting the port cities to inland plantations where Vietnamese workers labored under conditions that killed thousands each year. The colonial authorities imposed heavy taxes, payable only in French currency, forcing farmers to grow cash crops for export rather than rice for their own families. Traditional village councils lost their authority to French-appointed administrators. Schools taught French history and language while ignoring Vietnamese culture and literature that stretched back over 2 millennia. The colonial system created a rigid hierarchy that placed French citizens at the top, followed by mixed-race individuals known as Eurasians, then Vietnamese who had adopted French customs and religion, and finally the vast majority of Vietnamese who remained trapped at the bottom of this artificial pyramid. A Vietnamese man with a university degree might find himself taking orders from a French teenager fresh off the boat from Marseille. Vietnamese women who married French men could improve their social standing, but their children would forever exist in the liminal space between two worlds, never fully accepted by either. Yet in the shadows of French cafes and beneath the canopy of jungle leaves, something stirred. Nationalism, that powerful force that had already reshaped Europe and was beginning to awaken across Asia and Africa, took root in Vietnamese soil. Secret societies formed, spreading like underground rivers through villages and cities. Students in Hanoi passed forbidden books from hand to hand, works by Vietnamese poets and historians who celebrated the ancient kingdoms that had existed before French rule. Farmers whispered stories of ancient heroes like the Trung sisters, who had led a rebellion against Chinese occupation in the 1st century, and Tran Hung Dao, who had defeated Mongol invasions in the 13th century. These stories asked an implicit question: if such courage had risen before, might it rise again? The early resistance movements were fragmented and often tragic in their outcomes. The Can Vuong movement of the late 1800s had rallied around the young Emperor Ham Nghi, calling on Vietnamese to resist French rule until the last man. French forces crushed the rebellion with methodical brutality, executing thousands and sending the emperor into exile. Other uprisings followed, each met with the same fate. The French had learned from their experiences in Algeria and other colonies that swift, overwhelming violence could break the spirit of resistance before it spread. Among these dreamers of independence was a slight young man whose birth name was Nguyen Sin Cuong, but who would become known to history by many names, including Nguyen Ai Quoc and finally Ho Chi Minh. Born in 1890 in a village in Nha An province, where his father served as a minor official under French rule, Ho witnessed firsthand the daily humiliations of colonial life. His father, despite his education and Confucian scholarship, could never rise above the glass ceiling that reserved true authority for white faces. The family lived in a traditional wooden house with a thatched roof, but young Ho could see the French villas with their electric lights and modern conveniences, a constant reminder of the gulf between ruler and ruled. This injustice burned in the young man's memory as he left Vietnam in 1911, working as a cook on French steamships, studying in Paris, living in London, and gradually absorbing the revolutionary ideas that were reshaping the 20th century. In the galley of a passenger liner, he learned that French passengers expected Vietnamese crew members to be invisible, to serve their meals and clean their cabins without ever making eye contact or speaking unless spoken to. In Paris, he discovered that even Vietnamese who had adopted French language and customs were still regarded as exotic curiosities at best, dangerous primitives at worst. In the cafes of the Latin Quarter, Ho discovered the writings of Marx and Lenin, but also the words of the American Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. He read about the Haitian Revolution, where enslaved people had overthrown their masters and created the first Black Republic. He studied the Irish struggle for independence, noting how a small nation could resist the might of the British Empire through guerrilla warfare and political organizing. He saw the contradiction at the heart of Western civilization, how nations that proclaimed liberty and equality could simultaneously deny these very rights to millions of people in their colonies. This contradiction would fuel his life's work. During the First World War, Ho watched as European powers sent their colonial subjects to die in the trenches of France and Belgium. Vietnamese soldiers served in French units, promised equality and citizenship in return for their sacrifice. When the war ended, these promises evaporated like morning mist. The colonial hierarchy remained unchanged, and Vietnamese veterans returned home to find the same restrictions, the same humiliations, the same denial of basic rights that had driven them to seek better lives abroad. The Treaty of Versailles, which redrew the map of Europe and promised self-determination for European peoples, made no such promises for the colonized peoples of Asia and Africa. Ho Chi Minh, living in Paris under the name Nguyen Ai Quoc, rented a cheap room and printed leaflets demanding Vietnamese independence. He attended socialist meetings, learning the techniques of political organization, while never forgetting that his ultimate goal was not worldwide revolution but the simple dream of Vietnamese people governing themselves in their own land. The year 1940 brought an unexpected twist to Vietnam's colonial story. As German tanks rolled through the streets of Paris and France fell to Hitler's war machine, the distant colony of Indochina found itself under the control of Vichy France, the puppet government that collaborated with Nazi Germany. The irony was bitter. Vietnamese people now ruled by French officials who themselves took orders from German occupiers. Soon, Japanese forces arrived, not as conquerors but as partners in the Axis alliance, welcomed by French administrators who hoped that cooperation might preserve their positions. Vietnam now groaned under a double occupation. French administrators continued their daily routines, collecting taxes and enforcing colonial law, while Japanese soldiers patrolled the streets and extracted rice, rubber, and minerals for their own war effort. The Japanese demanded that Vietnamese farmers grow jute instead of rice, leading to a famine in 1944 and 1945 that killed between 1 and 2 million people. Bodies lay in the streets of Hanoi and Haiphong as Japanese and French officials continued to export food to feed their armies elsewhere in Asia. This chaos created opportunity for those patient enough to seize it. Ho Chi Minh, who had spent decades in exile learning the arts of revolution in Moscow and China, slipped back into Vietnam in 1941 after 30 years abroad. He was now 51 years old, his youthful idealism tempered by experience but his commitment to Vietnamese independence undiminished. In the misty mountains near the Chinese border, in caves hidden behind waterfalls and jungle paths known only to local hunters, he founded the Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam. The organization brought together communists, nationalists, religious leaders, and anyone else willing to fight for Vietnamese freedom regardless of their other political beliefs. They established hidden camps in limestone caves that had sheltered bandits and rebels for centuries, training guerrilla fighters in the arts of sabotage and ambush warfare. They learned to make explosives from fertilizer, to move through jungle paths without leaving tracks, to disappear into villages where every farmer might be a potential ally or informant. The Viet Minh began the patient work of building a shadow government that could one day replace foreign rule. They established schools that taught Vietnamese history and language, courts that settled disputes according to traditional Vietnamese law, and tax systems that funded their growing organization. In villages where French officials collected tribute for colonial authorities and Japanese soldiers requisitioned rice for their armies, Viet Minh organizers offered an alternative vision of Vietnamese people ruling themselves. The Viet Minh faced a delicate balancing act during the war years. They fought the Japanese occupiers while simultaneously preparing for the day when they would have to confront the French. who would surely return after the World War ended. They rescued Allied prisoners of war, hoping to build relationships with the Americans and British who they believed might support Vietnamese independence after the defeat of fascism. American Office of Strategic Services agents operating behind Japanese lines occasionally worked with Ho's forces against their common enemy. Ho even helped rescue downed American pilots, hiding them in mountain caves and guiding them back to Allied territory. He saw these collaborations as investments in Vietnam's future, believing that Americans who had fought their own revolution against colonial rule would naturally support Vietnamese independence. In his correspondence with OSS officers, Ho quoted extensively from the American Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, demonstrating his deep familiarity with the documents that had inspired his own revolutionary dreams. He spoke fluent English and French, discussing political philosophy with American agents who found him remarkably well-educated and moderate in his views. These Americans would later testify that Ho seemed more like a Vietnamese George Washington than a dangerous communist revolutionary. As 1945 dawned, the Japanese grip on Southeast Asia began to weaken under the relentless pressure of American military advances across the Pacific. American bombers filled the skies over Vietnam, targeting Japanese installations while carefully avoiding French colonial infrastructure that would be needed after the war. The atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August brought sudden surrender, leaving Vietnam once again in the hands of uncertain fate. In the power vacuum that followed, Ho Chi Minh seized his moment with the skill of a master politician. His Viet Minh forces occupied government buildings in Hanoi and other major cities, while carefully avoiding confrontations with departing Japanese troops. On September 2, 1945, a date chosen deliberately to coincide with the Japanese surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Ho declared Vietnam's independence before a crowd of 500,000 people gathered in Hanoi's Ba Dinh Square. His speech began with words borrowed directly from the American Declaration of Independence, spoken in Vietnamese to a crowd that had never heard such concepts expressed in their own language by one of their own leaders. "All men are created equal," he declared. "They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The crowd roared approval, sensing that this moment represented not just political independence but cultural liberation, the right to define themselves rather than be defined by foreign rulers. For a brief shining moment in the autumn of 1945, it seemed that Vietnam might achieve the peaceful independence that other colonies would eventually win through negotiation rather than war. Ho even wrote letters to President Harry Truman seeking American recognition and support for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. These letters went unanswered, lost in the bureaucratic maze of a State Department already focused on containing Soviet expansion in Europe. But the Cold War was beginning to reshape global politics, and Vietnam's strategic location made it a prize that neither East nor West was willing to abandon. The French, humiliated by their defeat in Europe and desperate to restore their global prestige, had no intention of honoring Vietnamese independence. Charles de Gaulle and other French leaders saw Indochina as essential to France's claim to great power status in the post-war world. Without their empire, they feared France would become a mere satellite of either American or Soviet power. What followed was the First Indochina War, a brutal 8-year conflict that would preview the larger tragedy to come and demonstrate that the age of easy colonial rule had ended forever. The map in President Dwight Eisenhower's Oval Office showed a world divided into spheres of influence, painted in the stark colors of the Cold War. Red marked Soviet territories, blue denoted American allies, and scattered across Asia and Africa were patches of uncertain green, nations teetering between the two superpowers like leaves in a hurricane. In 1954, as French forces limped home from their defeat at Dien Bien Phu, Vietnam occupied a particularly troubling shade of green on that map. Eisenhower, the former Supreme Allied commander who had orchestrated D-Day, understood military strategy better than most presidents. But Southeast Asia presented puzzles that could not be solved with tanks and bombers. At press conferences, he would reach for a simple analogy that would haunt American foreign policy for decades. If you knock over the first domino in a row, he explained to reporters, all the others will fall in sequence. Should Vietnam fall to communist control, Laos and Cambodia would follow, then Thailand and Burma, until the red tide reached the shores of Australia and the strategic sea lanes that connected America to its allies in the Pacific. This domino theory rested on assumptions that seemed logical in Washington but ignored the complex realities of Asian politics. Each nation had its own history, culture, and internal conflicts that could not be reduced to simple Cold War calculations. The Vietnamese struggle for independence had begun decades before anyone in Hanoi had heard of Karl Marx, rooted in centuries of resistance to foreign domination rather than allegiance to Moscow's brand of communism. But in the atmosphere of the 1950s, such nuances seemed like dangerous luxuries that America could not afford. The French withdrawal left South Vietnam under the leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic intellectual who had spent years in exile rather than collaborate with either the French or the Japanese. Diem possessed qualities that appealed to American policymakers. He was fiercely anti-communist, Western-educated, and spoke fluent English. He also came from a prominent family with connections to the Vietnamese elite, suggesting he might be able to build a stable government south of the 17th parallel. Yet Diem's strengths on paper translated poorly to the messy reality of governing a fractured nation. His Catholicism made him suspect to the Buddhist majority, while his years abroad had left him out of touch with the daily struggles of ordinary Vietnamese. Most problematically, his vision of democracy bore little resemblance to the ideals America claimed to champion. Diem believed in hierarchy, order, and the enlightened rule of educated elites like himself, concepts that put him at odds with traditional Vietnamese village governance and American notions of popular sovereignty. Under Eisenhower's guidance, American aid began flowing to South Vietnam in increasing amounts. Military advisors arrived to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, known by its acronym ARVN. American engineers built roads and airports, American doctors established clinics, and American educators founded schools designed to compete with communist propaganda in the villages. The aid came with strings attached, requiring South Vietnamese officials to accept American oversight of major decisions and follow American advice on military strategy. The advisory mission operated under strict limitations designed to avoid direct American involvement in combat. The Geneva Accords had established an international control commission to monitor the temporary division of Vietnam and ensure that foreign military forces did not destabilize the region. American advisors wore civilian clothes, carried no weapons in public, and officially served only in training and support roles. This fiction became increasingly difficult to maintain as the security situation deteriorated and American personnel found themselves in harm's way. The promised elections of 1956 never materialized, blocked by Diem's government with full American support. Both sides understood that Ho Chi Minh would likely win any nationwide vote, given his status as the leader who had successfully expelled the French and declared independence. Instead of democratic reunification, Vietnam settled into an uneasy partition that resembled the division of Korea, with two governments claiming legitimacy over the entire country and neither willing to accept permanent separation. This stalemate suited neither the communists in Hanoi nor the growing number of southern Vietnamese who had supported the Viet Minh during the war against France. Former resistance fighters found themselves branded as traitors by the Diem government, their wartime service forgotten in the new struggle against communism. Some accepted amnesty and attempted to build peaceful lives, but others returned to the jungles and rice paddies to continue the fight under a new banner, the National Liberation Front, which American officials would call the Viet Cong. The insurgency that emerged in South Vietnam during the late 1950s differed significantly from the conventional war that had defeated the French. Instead of large military units engaging in set-piece battles, the Viet Cong relied on small cells of fighters who lived among the civilian population and struck government targets before melting back into the countryside. They assassinated village officials loyal to Saigon, destroyed bridges and power lines, and collected taxes to fund their operations, gradually establishing parallel government structures in areas where Diem's authority remained weak. American intelligence reports from this period paint a picture of growing confusion and frustration among both American advisors and South Vietnamese officials. The enemy seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, capable of striking at will, but impossible to pin down for decisive battle. Traditional military tactics proved useless against opponents who wore no uniforms, carried no flags, and could transform from farmers by day into fighters by night. The very qualities that made Vietnamese culture resilient under centuries of foreign occupation now worked against the American-backed government in Saigon. When John Kennedy assumed the presidency in January 1961, he inherited not just the Vietnam problem, but a broader crisis of confidence in American power. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba had embarrassed the new administration, while Nikita Khrushchev's promises to support wars of national liberation suggested that the Cold War was entering a more dangerous phase. Kennedy, young and inexperienced in foreign affairs, felt pressure to demonstrate American resolve somewhere in the world. Vietnam offered an opportunity to draw a line against communist expansion without risking nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. Kennedy's approach to Vietnam reflected his generation's faith in American expertise and technology. If traditional military methods failed to defeat guerrilla warfare, then America would develop new methods. The Pentagon created special forces units trained in counterinsurgency tactics, while the Central Intelligence Agency launched programs designed to win the hearts and minds of rural Vietnamese through economic development and political reform. These efforts assumed that Vietnamese peasants would choose the American-backed government once they understood the benefits of freedom and prosperity. The reality proved more complicated than Kennedy's advisors anticipated. The Strategic Hamlet Program, designed to relocate rural populations into fortified villages where they could be protected from Viet Cong influence, often accomplished the opposite of its intended goals. Farmers forced to leave ancestral lands and live behind barbed wire began to sympathize with the guerrillas who promised to restore traditional ways of life. Government officials assigned to run the hamlets frequently proved corrupt or incompetent, confirming villagers' suspicions that the Saigon regime served foreign interests rather than Vietnamese needs. Meanwhile, the number of American advisors grew from fewer than 700 under Eisenhower to over 16,000 by the end of Kennedy's presidency. These men found themselves increasingly involved in combat operations despite official restrictions on their role. Helicopter pilots flew South Vietnamese troops into battle zones, intelligence officers interrogated captured prisoners, and special forces teams conducted raids deep in enemy-controlled territory. The line between advice and participation blurred as American personnel realized that their South Vietnamese counterparts often lacked the training equipment or motivation necessary to defeat the insurgency. The Buddhist crisis of 1963 shattered any remaining illusions about Diem's ability to build a stable, democratic government. When Buddhist monks organized protests against religious discrimination, Diem's security forces responded with brutal suppression that shocked even his American supporters. Television footage of elderly monks being beaten by police, and most dramatically, the self-immolation of Thich Quang Duc in a Saigon intersection, broadcast around the world images that contradicted American claims about defending freedom in Southeast Asia. The famous photograph of the burning monk became one of the defining images of the Vietnam era, a visual representation of the moral complexity that American policymakers had tried to ignore. Here was a man so opposed to the government America supported that he was willing to die in the most agonizing way possible to protest its policies. The image raised uncomfortable questions about whether America was truly supporting democracy and human rights or simply opposing communism regardless of the character of its allies. Behind closed doors in Washington, Kennedy administration officials debated whether to continue supporting Diem or encourage the South Vietnamese military to remove him from power. The decision was complicated by uncertainty about who might replace Diem and whether a military coup would create more stability or simply accelerate the country's descent into chaos. American Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. favored regime change, arguing that Diem had become more of a liability than an asset in the fight against communism. The coup came on November 1, 1963, carried out by a group of South Vietnamese generals who had grown frustrated with Diem's autocratic rule and his family's corruption. American officials had given tacit approval for the plot while maintaining plausible deniability about direct involvement. The plan called for Diem and his brother Nu to be given safe passage out of the country, but events spiraled beyond anyone's control when the brothers were captured and murdered in the back of an armored personnel carrier. News of Diem's assassination reached Washington just 3 weeks before Kennedy's own death in Dallas, creating a tragic symmetry that seemed to symbolize America's deepening entanglement in Vietnamese affairs. The young president, who had promised to bear any burden and pay any price in defense of liberty, had discovered that some burdens were heavier than anticipated and some prices higher than expected. His successor, Lyndon Johnson, would inherit a deteriorating situation that offered no easy solutions, only choices between different forms of escalation. The generals who replaced Diem proved no more capable of governing effectively than their predecessor had been. A series of coups and counter-coups followed through 1964 and 65, creating a revolving door of military leaders who focused more on political survival than fighting the Viet Cong. Each change of government disrupted ongoing programs and forced American advisors to build new relationships with officials who might themselves be overthrown within months. This political instability provided opportunities for the communist forces, who had maintained consistent leadership and clear objectives throughout the period of turmoil in Saigon. Ho Chi Minh and his colleagues in Hanoi watched the chaos in the south with satisfaction, believing that time favored their cause as long as they could maintain pressure on the weakening Saigon government. They increased their support for the Viet Cong, sending weapons, supplies, and eventually regular North Vietnamese troops down what became known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia. By late 1964, American intelligence estimates suggested that South Vietnam might collapse entirely without massive increases in American support. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam was losing territory, weapons, and morale at an alarming rate. Viet Cong forces controlled large portions of the countryside, collected taxes from hundreds of thousands of people, and operated their own schools, courts, and medical facilities in areas where the Saigon government existed only on maps in Washington and Saigon. Johnson faced the same dilemma that had confronted his predecessors, whether to accept the loss of South Vietnam to communist control or escalate American involvement to levels that might prevent defeat, but would certainly transform the conflict into an American war. The domino theory suggested that retreat would lead to communist victories throughout Southeast Asia, while escalation risked creating another Korea, with American ground forces fighting Asian communists in a land war that the American public might not support indefinitely. The president's advisors were divided between those who favored immediate, overwhelming force to end the conflict quickly, and those who preferred gradual escalation designed to demonstrate American resolve while leaving room for negotiated settlement. Johnson himself remained torn between his domestic priorities, particularly the Great Society programs he hoped would define his presidency, and the foreign policy inheritance that seemed to demand increasingly costly commitments in a distant land that most Americans could not locate on a map. Events in the Tonkin Gulf during August 1964 would force Johnson's hand, providing the legal and political justification for the escalation that military advisors had been recommending for months. America's long commitment to South Vietnam was about to become something far more dangerous and costly than anyone in Washington had imagined when the first advisors arrived a decade earlier. The destroyers USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy sliced through the dark waters of the Gulf of Tonkin on a muggy August night in 1964, their radar screens painting ghostly images of approaching vessels that may or may not have existed. Radio chatter crackled between the ships as sonar operators reported torpedo attacks that left no physical evidence, no debris, no oil slicks on the moonlit surface of the South China Sea. What happened in those hours remains disputed to this day, but the political consequences were immediate and irreversible. President Johnson seized upon these murky events to request what would become the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a congressional authorization that granted him unprecedented power to escalate American involvement in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. The vote was nearly unanimous, 414-0 in the House, 88-2 in the Senate, reflecting a nation still confident in its leaders and convinced that American military might could solve any international problem swiftly and decisively. The resolution's language was deliberately vague, authorizing the president to take all necessary measures to repel attacks against American forces and prevent further aggression. Johnson assured Congress and the American people that he sought no wider war, that his goal remained the limited objective of helping South Vietnam defend itself against communist infiltration. Behind closed doors, however, Pentagon planners were already drawing up target lists for a bombing campaign designed to break North Vietnam's will to continue supporting the insurgency in the South. The strategic logic seemed compelling to officials who had grown up during World War II, when sustained bombing had helped bring Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan to their knees. North Vietnam was a poor agricultural nation with limited industrial capacity and a primitive transportation network. Surely a few months of precision strikes against key military and industrial targets would convince Ho Chi Minh that supporting the Viet Cong was too costly to continue. The campaign would demonstrate American resolve while avoiding the risks and casualties associated with large-scale ground combat. Operation Rolling Thunder began on March 2, 1965, with strikes against ammunition depots and military installations just north of the demilitarized zone that separated the two Vietnams. The initial attacks were carefully limited in scope and geographic area, designed to send a message rather than inflict maximum damage. Johnson personally approved target lists from the White House, micromanaging the campaign with a level of detail that frustrated military commanders who preferred to conduct operations without political interference. The first waves of aircraft took off from aircraft carriers in the South China Sea and air bases in South Vietnam and Thailand, their pilots confident that this would be a brief surgical campaign against an enemy that lacked modern air defenses. F-105 Thunder Chiefs, the workhorses of the operation, could carry up to 14,000 pounds of bombs and rockets, while F-4 Phantoms provided air superiority and close air support. The technology seemed overwhelmingly superior to anything North Vietnam could deploy in response. Yet the North Vietnamese proved more resilient and resourceful than American planners had anticipated. Within weeks of the bombing's commencement, Soviet and Chinese military advisors began arriving in Hanoi with surface-to-air missile systems, radar installations, and anti-aircraft guns that transformed North Vietnam's air defenses from negligible to formidable. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the network of paths and roads through Laos and Cambodia that supplied communist forces in South Vietnam, was quickly dispersed and concealed, making it nearly impossible to locate from the air. The trail itself became a marvel of military engineering and human determination, a constantly shifting maze of footpaths, bicycle routes, and truck roads that snake through some of the most challenging terrain in Southeast Asia. North Vietnamese engineers built bridges underwater to hide them from aerial reconnaissance, constructed hospitals and supply depots in limestone caves, and developed elaborate camouflage techniques that made military installations virtually invisible from aircraft flying overhead. Thousands of young men and women worked along the trail, repairing bomb damage within hours of each attack, carrying supplies on their backs when trucks could not get through, and maintaining communication networks that kept the entire system functioning despite constant harassment from American aircraft. They developed a culture of collective sacrifice and ingenuity, turning the bombing campaign into a test of national will rather than a simple calculation of industrial capacity. The rules of engagement imposed by Washington severely limited the bombing's effectiveness. Pilots were prohibited from attacking targets within certain distances of the Chinese border, forbidden from striking civilian areas, and required to obtain approval for attacks on any installation that might have dual military and civilian purposes. These restrictions, designed to prevent the conflict from expanding into a wider war with China or the Soviet Union, created safe havens where North Vietnamese forces could regroup and resupply between bombing missions. American aircrews quickly discovered that flying over North Vietnam was far more dangerous than the intelligence briefings had suggested. Surface-to-air missiles, known as SAMs, created deadly corridors through which aircraft had to fly to reach their targets. Anti-aircraft artillery filled the sky with explosive shells that could destroy a plane with a single hit. Most challenging of all were the North Vietnamese fighter pilots, flying Soviet-built MiG aircraft with skill and determination that surprised their American counterparts. The shoot-down of Lieutenant Commander Everett Alvarez on August 5, 1964, marked the beginning of what would become a tragic chapter in the larger Vietnam story. Alvarez became the first American pilot captured by North Vietnam, beginning an ordeal in the prison camps that American prisoners of war would call the Hanoi Hilton. The propaganda value of captured American pilots gave North Vietnam a powerful weapon in the international struggle for public opinion. As the bombing campaign intensified through 1965 and 1966, the target list expanded to include transportation networks, industrial facilities, and eventually much of North Vietnam's infrastructure. Yet each escalation seemed to produce diminishing returns, with North Vietnamese resistance growing stronger rather than weaker as the campaign progressed. The country's economy adapted to constant bombardment, dispersing production facilities and moving essential services underground or into rural areas. The human cost mounted steadily on both sides. American pilots faced some of the most sophisticated air defenses in the world, losing aircraft and crews at rates that shocked military planners who had expected technological superiority to provide overwhelming advantages. By the end of 1966, North Vietnam had shot down over 400 American aircraft, capturing or killing experienced pilots whose training had cost millions of dollars and years of preparation. For the North Vietnamese people, the bombing created a siege mentality that strengthened rather than weakened their commitment to the war effort. Children grew up in underground shelters, learning to distinguish between different types of aircraft by the sound of their engines. Schools and hospitals relocated to caves, while farmers worked their fields at night to avoid the attention of reconnaissance aircraft. The shared suffering created a sense of national unity that transcended regional and political differences. The propaganda war became as important as the military campaign itself. North Vietnamese officials invited foreign journalists to witness the destruction of schools, hospitals, and other civilian targets, arguing that America was waging war against the Vietnamese people rather than limiting its attacks to military objectives. Photographs of wounded children and destroyed villages circulated internationally, undermining American claims that the bombing was precise and discriminate. The Christmas bombing pause of 1965 represented Johnson's attempt to demonstrate American willingness to negotiate while maintaining military pressure on North Vietnam. For 37 days, American aircraft ceased their attacks while diplomats explored possibilities for peace talks. The pause allowed North Vietnam to repair damaged facilities and strengthen its air defenses, while Ho Chi Minh's government used the respite to demonstrate that it would not be bombed into submission. When the bombing resumed in January 1966, it encountered even stronger resistance than before. The temporary halt had convinced many North Vietnamese that American resolve was weakening, that the domestic political costs of the war were beginning to outweigh its strategic benefits. This perception encouraged continued resistance rather than the negotiated settlement that Johnson had hoped the pause might produce. The targeting of petroleum facilities marked a significant escalation in the summer of 1966, as American aircraft struck oil storage depots near Hanoi and Haiphong, despite fears that Soviet or Chinese personnel might be killed in the attacks. The raids achieved their immediate objective of destroying most of North Vietnam's stored fuel supplies, but the country's transportation system adapted by importing gasoline in small quantities through China and using bicycles and human labor where motorized transport was no longer possible. Intelligence analysts struggled to measure the bombing's effectiveness using traditional metrics that had worked in previous conflicts. Counting destroyed buildings, severed rail lines, and eliminated vehicles provided impressive statistics but failed to capture the campaign's actual impact on North Vietnam's ability to support the war in the south. The flow of supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail continued despite constant bombardment, while North Vietnamese regular forces began appearing in South Vietnam in increasing numbers. The weather over North Vietnam added another layer of complexity to the bombing campaign. Monsoon seasons limited flying conditions for months at a time, while thick cloud cover made precision bombing nearly impossible. Pilots often returned to base with full bomb loads rather than risk hitting unintended targets, further reducing the campaign's military effectiveness while providing North Vietnamese forces with regular respites from aerial attack. By late 1966, some American officials began questioning whether bombing alone could achieve the political objectives that had justified the campaign's initiation. The North Vietnamese economy had proven remarkably adaptable to sustained bombardment, while international opinion increasingly viewed the United States as a superpower using excessive force against a small, poor nation fighting for its independence. The scientific community added its voice to the growing chorus of criticism, with studies suggesting that conventional bombing could not significantly reduce the flow of supplies to communist forces in South Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail required only a few tons of material per day to sustain guerrilla operations, a quantity that could be transported by human carriers even if all motorized transport were eliminated. The bombing was destroying North Vietnam's modern infrastructure while having minimal impact on its ability to support a low-intensity conflict in the south. Yet stopping the bombing carried its own political risks for Johnson, who feared that any sign of weakness would encourage further communist aggression and undermine American credibility with allies around the world. The president found himself trapped between military advisors who wanted to expand the bombing to include previously restricted targets and political advisors who warned that the campaign was becoming a public relations disaster that strengthened opposition to the war both domestically and internationally. As 1967 dawned, Operation Rolling Thunder had become the longest sustained bombing campaign in American history, but its strategic objectives remained as elusive as ever. The raids had failed to break North Vietnamese morale, reduce infiltration into South Vietnam, or bring Ho Chi Minh's government to the negotiating table on terms acceptable to Washington. Instead, the campaign had escalated the conflict while hardening positions on both sides, making a negotiated settlement more difficult rather than more likely. The stage was set for an even more dramatic escalation as American ground forces prepared to take on the primary burden of fighting a war that bombing had failed to win. The skies over North Vietnam would continue to thunder with the sound of American aircraft, but the decisive battles of the Vietnam War would be fought in the jungles and rice paddies of the South, where technology would prove less decisive than human will and endurance. The helicopter rotors beat a rhythmic thunder across the emerald canopy as the first waves of American combat troops descended into landing zone X-ray in the Ia Drang Valley during November 1965. Below them stretched an alien landscape of towering trees, tangled vines, and shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. This was not the open desert warfare for which American forces had trained, nor the urban combat of World War II, but something entirely different, a conflict where the very environment became an enemy as dangerous as any human opponent. Staff Sergeant Jimmy Nakayama from Hawaii clutched his M16 rifle as the Huey helicopter touched down in a clearing barely large enough for the aircraft. The vegetation pressed in from all sides like green walls, creating a sense of claustrophobia that no amount of training could have prepared him for. Within minutes of landing, his unit came under fire from positions they could not see, muzzle flashes winking from the jungle like deadly fireflies in the perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. The Battle of Ia Drang marked the first major engagement between American and North Vietnamese regular forces, a three-day firefight that previewed the grinding warfare to come. American soldiers discovered that their technological advantages meant little in terrain where visibility rarely exceeded a few dozen yards and radio communications were blocked by the dense vegetation. The enemy moved through the jungle like ghosts, appearing suddenly to deliver devastating attacks before vanishing back into the green maze. Helicopter warfare evolved rapidly to meet these challenges, transforming the American military's approach to combat mobility in ways that would influence tactics for decades to come. The UH-1 Huey became the signature aircraft of the Vietnam War, capable of inserting troops into remote landing zones, evacuating wounded soldiers, and providing close air support with door-mounted machine guns. Pilots learned to navigate by following rivers and roads through jungle valleys where traditional landmarks disappeared beneath the canopy. Medical evacuation, known as dust-off, reached new levels of sophistication as helicopter crews risked their lives to retrieve wounded soldiers from contested areas. The distinctive whop-whop sound of approaching rotors became a lifeline for ground troops, representing the difference between life and death for soldiers wounded in firefights far from conventional medical facilities. Crews often flew multiple missions per day, landing in clearings under enemy fire to load stretchers while bullets sparked off their aircraft's aluminum skin. The enemy that American forces faced in the jungles bore little resemblance to the conventional armies they had studied in military schools. Viet Cong fighters wore no uniforms, carried no flags, and followed no rules of engagement that American soldiers could recognize. They might appear as farmers working in rice paddies during the day, only to transform into deadly combatants who struck military convoys at night before melting back into the civilian population at dawn. These guerrilla tactics exploited every weakness in American military doctrine, which emphasized firepower, mobility, and technological superiority over the kind of patient, small-unit operations that jungle warfare demanded. American patrols found themselves walking into carefully prepared ambushes where the enemy held every advantage of terrain, timing, and local knowledge. Booby traps became a constant menace, from punji stakes smeared with human waste to improvised explosive devices crafted from discarded artillery shells. The development of tunnel systems represented perhaps the most ingenious aspect of Viet Cong military engineering. Beneath the battlefields of South Vietnam, Communist forces excavated vast underground complexes that served as command centers, hospitals, weapons factories, and living quarters for thousands of fighters. The tunnels at Cu Chi, northwest of Saigon, stretched for over 100 miles underground, creating a hidden world that allowed guerrilla forces to appear and disappear at will. American soldiers assigned to tunnel exploration, known as tunnel rats, faced some of the most terrifying duty of the entire war. Armed only with pistols and flashlights, these volunteers crawled through narrow passages barely wide enough for a human body, never knowing whether the next turn might bring them face to face with an enemy fighter or an explosive booby trap. The psychological stress of underground combat took a heavy toll on these specialized troops, many of whom were chosen for their small stature and nerves of steel. Chemical warfare took on new dimensions in the Vietnamese jungle, where dense vegetation provided perfect concealment for enemy forces. Agent Orange, Agent Blue, and other herbicides were sprayed from specially equipped aircraft to strip leaves from trees and destroy crops that might feed guerrilla fighters. Operation Ranch Hand, the military program responsible for these missions, eventually covered millions of acres with chemical defoliants, creating barren moonscapes where lush jungle had once thrived. The environmental and human consequences of this chemical campaign would not become fully apparent for decades, as veterans began developing cancers and other illnesses linked to exposure to dioxin and other toxic compounds. Vietnamese civilians bore an even heavier burden, with birth defects and health problems affecting multiple generations in areas where the chemicals were most heavily applied. The immediate tactical benefits of defoliation proved limited, as enemy forces simply adapted to the changed terrain and found new forms of concealment. Napalm became another signature weapon of the ground war, a jellied gasoline that created firestorms capable of clearing enemy positions from jungle terrain where conventional explosives had limited effect. The sticky substance burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, consuming oxygen and creating suffocating conditions that could kill even soldiers in underground bunkers. Television footage of napalm strikes, with their characteristic rolling orange fireballs, brought the war's brutality into American living rooms with unprecedented immediacy. The search and destroy strategy that guided much of the American ground campaign reflected conventional military thinking poorly adapted to guerrilla warfare. Large American units would sweep through suspected enemy areas, hoping to locate and eliminate Viet Cong forces through superior firepower and mobility. Yet these operations often resembled hunting expeditions where the prey possessed intimate knowledge of the terrain and could choose when and where to engage their pursuers. Body counts became the primary metric for measuring success in these operations, a grim arithmetic that reduced the war's complexity to simple numbers of enemy killed versus American casualties. This emphasis on statistics created perverse incentives that sometimes led to the inclusion of civilian casualties in enemy death tolls, as unit commanders faced pressure to demonstrate the effectiveness of their operations through impressive kill ratios. The My Lai massacre of March 16, 1968, represented the darkest consequences of this dehumanizing approach to warfare. Lieutenant William Calley's platoon entered the village believing they would encounter a heavily armed Viet Cong battalion, only to find women, children, and elderly men going about their daily routines. The subsequent slaughter of over 300 civilians shocked the world when details finally emerged, forcing Americans to confront the moral costs of fighting an enemy that hid among the innocent. Pacification programs attempted to address the political dimensions of the conflict by winning the allegiance of rural Vietnamese through economic development and improved security. American advisors worked with South Vietnamese officials to build schools, clinics, and roads in contested areas, hoping to demonstrate that the Saigon government offered better prospects for the future than communist promises of land reform and independence. The Combined Action Program represented one of the most innovative approaches to counterinsurgency, embedding small teams of American Marines with local militia units in village defense efforts. These Marines lived among Vietnamese civilians for months at a time, learning local customs and building relationships that went beyond the temporary presence of conventional military units. The program showed promise in areas where it was implemented, but never received sufficient resources to expand beyond a few provinces. The Phoenix program took a more aggressive approach to the political war, targeting the Viet Cong infrastructure through intelligence operations designed to identify and eliminate communist organizers in rural areas. American advisors worked with South Vietnamese security forces to build networks of informants and conduct raids against suspected enemy agents. The program succeeded in disrupting communist political activities in some regions, but also generated resentment among civilians who found themselves caught between competing intelligence services. Fire support bases became the backbone of American defensive strategy, heavily fortified positions that could provide artillery support for infantry operations across large areas of countryside. These bases, carved out of jungle clearings and hilltops, bristled with howitzers, mortars, and machine guns capable of delivering devastating firepower within minutes of radio requests from units in contact with enemy forces. The bases themselves became prime targets for enemy attack, leading to spectacular battles where hundreds of rockets and mortars rained down on American positions. The siege of Khe Sanh during the first months of 1968 exemplified the grinding nature of these defensive battles. For 77 days, North Vietnamese forces surrounded the isolated Marine base near the demilitarized zone, subjecting it to constant artillery bombardment while threatening a massive ground assault that never materialized. The siege tied down thousands of American troops and dominated news coverage, becoming a symbol of American determination to hold strategic positions regardless of cost. Medical advances during the Vietnam War saved thousands of lives that would have been lost in previous conflicts, as helicopter evacuation reduced the time between wounding and surgery to unprecedented levels. Field hospitals equipped with the latest surgical techniques and blood banking technology operated within helicopter range of most combat areas, giving wounded soldiers survival rates that amazed military surgeons. These medical miracles came at the cost of creating a generation of severely disabled veterans whose survival placed new demands on a society unprepared for their needs. The draft lottery that supplied manpower for the ground war created deep social tensions within American society, as college students and middle-class youth found ways to avoid service while working-class men bore a disproportionate burden of combat duty. The average age of American soldiers in Vietnam was 19, significantly younger than in previous wars, reflecting both the demographics of the draft and the physical demands of jungle warfare that favored youth and fitness over experience. Racial tensions within the military reflected broader social conflicts in American society during the Civil Rights era. African American soldiers, who comprised a disproportionate percentage of combat units, faced discrimination both within the military hierarchy and in their treatment by Vietnamese civilians who had been influenced by decades of colonial racial attitudes. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968 triggered racial incidents on military bases throughout South Vietnam, forcing commanders to address issues they had hoped to ignore. Drug use became increasingly common among American troops as the war dragged on without clear signs of progress or victory. Marijuana was readily available and widely used, while harder drugs like heroin could be purchased openly in many rear areas. The military's traditional disciplinary approaches proved inadequate to address substance abuse problems that reflected deeper issues of morale and purpose among soldiers fighting a war that many had come to question. Fragging incidents, where disgruntled soldiers attacked their own officers with grenades or other weapons, reached alarming levels during the later years of the conflict. These attacks reflected the breakdown of traditional military discipline and unit cohesion that had sustained American forces through previous wars. Officers found themselves caught between demands from higher headquarters for aggressive operations and resistance from troops who questioned the wisdom of risking their lives for objectives that seemed increasingly meaningless. The Tet Offensive of 1968 would demonstrate that years of search and destroy operations, chemical warfare, and technological superiority had failed to break the enemy's will or capacity to fight. Instead of weakening, Communist forces had grown stronger and more sophisticated, capable of launching coordinated attacks against targets throughout South Vietnam. The ground war had reached a stalemate that no amount of additional firepower or troops seemed capable of breaking, setting the stage for a political and psychological defeat that would reshape American foreign policy for generations. The firecrackers began exploding just after midnight on January 30th, 1968, their sharp cracks echoing through the narrow streets of Saigon as Vietnamese families welcomed the Year of the Monkey. For centuries, Tet had marked the most sacred holiday in Vietnamese culture, a time when ancestors were honored, debts forgiven, and the promise of renewal filled the air with incense and celebration. This year, however, the firecrackers masked a different kind of explosion as communist commandos emerged from hiding places throughout South Vietnam's cities. In the pre-dawn darkness, 19 Viet Cong sappers cut through the fence surrounding the American embassy in Saigon, their wire cutters snipping through chain link that was supposed to protect the symbol of American power in Southeast Asia. For 6 hours, the embassy compound became a battlefield as Marine guards fought desperately to prevent the attackers from entering the main building. Television cameras captured images that would haunt American consciousness, the embassy lawn littered with bodies while helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures. The embassy attack was merely one thread in a tapestry of coordinated assaults that struck over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam simultaneously. From the ancient imperial capital of Hue to the bustling port city of Da Nang, from remote provincial capitals to major military installations, communist forces emerged from the shadows to challenge American and South Vietnamese control with audacity that stunned military commanders who had proclaimed the enemy's imminent defeat just weeks earlier. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the architect of victory at Dien Bien Phu, had spent months planning this offensive with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his earlier triumphs. Intelligence networks built over years of patient recruitment provided precise information about American patrol schedules, guard rotations, and defensive weaknesses. Weapons and ammunition had been smuggled into urban areas hidden in flower deliveries, funeral processions, and vegetable carts that aroused no suspicion from security forces focused on rural infiltration routes. The timing was carefully calculated to exploit both Vietnamese cultural traditions and American political vulnerabilities. Tet celebrations provided perfect cover for the movement of personnel and equipment as increased traffic and gatherings throughout the country masked unusual activity that might otherwise have attracted attention. In the United States, 1968 was a presidential election year with growing public skepticism about the war's progress, creating political pressure that military setbacks might transform into demands for withdrawal. In Hue, the old imperial city that had served as Vietnam's capital for over a century, communist forces achieved their most spectacular success by capturing the ancient citadel and raising the gold-starred flag of North Vietnam over the palace where emperors had once held court. For 25 days, house-to-house fighting raged through streets lined with temples and pagodas that had witnessed centuries of Vietnamese history. The battle became a symbol of the war's destructive impact on Vietnamese cultural heritage, as artillery and airstrikes reduced architectural treasures to rubble. Captain Chuck Meadows from Texas led his Marine company through the maze of courtyards and ceremonial halls within the citadel, where every doorway might conceal a sniper and every garden could hide a machine gun nest. The Marines had trained for beach assaults and jungle warfare, but urban combat in a historic district required different skills and imposed agonizing choices between military necessity and cultural preservation. Each decision to call in artillery support meant destroying irreplaceable artifacts of Vietnamese civilization, The psychological impact of the Tet Offensive far exceeded its military significance, shattering the comfortable assumptions that had sustained American public support for the war effort. For months, government officials had portrayed the conflict as a series of military successes that were gradually wearing down enemy resistance. The sight of communist forces fighting inside the American embassy compound contradicted these optimistic assessments in ways that no amount of subsequent explanation could repair. Television coverage brought the fighting directly into American living rooms with an immediacy that transformed public perception of the war's progress. Network correspondents reported live from battlefields where American soldiers were fighting for their lives, while camera crews captured images of destruction and chaos that bore no resemblance to the controlled, limited conflict that officials had described. The medium itself became part of the story, as television's visual power overwhelmed traditional print journalism's more nuanced analysis. Walter Cronkite, the CBS anchor whose evening news broadcasts reached millions of American families, traveled to Vietnam in February to assess the situation personally. His subsequent editorial commentary, delivered with the gravitas that had made him the most trusted voice in American journalism, concluded that the war had reached a bloody stalemate with no prospect for decisive victory. When Cronkite turned against the war, President Johnson reportedly remarked that he had lost Middle America. The offensive's military results were mixed in ways that highlighted the complex nature of guerrilla warfare and urban combat. Communist forces succeeded in demonstrating their ability to strike anywhere in South Vietnam, including targets that American officials had considered absolutely secure. The coordination required to launch simultaneous attacks across such a wide geographic area proved that communist command and control systems were far more sophisticated than intelligence estimates had suggested. However, the attacks also exposed communist forces to conventional retaliation that inflicted devastating casualties on units that had emerged from hiding to hold fixed positions. American firepower, so ineffective against an enemy that avoided direct confrontation, proved lethal when applied against fighters who had chosen to stand and fight in urban environments. Estimates suggest that communist forces lost between 30 and 40,000 fighters during the offensive, including many experienced cadres who could not be easily replaced. The uprising that communist leaders had hoped would accompany their military offensive never materialized among the South Vietnamese population. Despite years of Viet Cong propaganda promising liberation from American domination and corrupt government rule, urban residents largely remained passive observers of the fighting rather than active supporters of either side. This popular neutrality reflected war weariness rather than satisfaction with the Saigon government, but it denied communist forces the mass support that might have transformed tactical victories into strategic success. The siege of Khe Sanh, which had dominated news coverage for weeks before Tet, now appeared in a different light as analysts debated whether it had been a genuine assault or an elaborate deception designed to draw American attention away from urban areas. The 77-day siege had indeed tied down thousands of American troops and consumed enormous quantities of supplies, but whether this represented brilliant enemy strategy or fortunate coincidence remained unclear to intelligence analysts struggling to understand communist intentions. General William Westmoreland, the American commander in Vietnam, proclaimed the Tet Offensive a decisive defeat for communist forces and requested additional troops to exploit what he saw as an opportunity to destroy weakened enemy units. His request for over 200,000 additional soldiers forced the Johnson administration to confront the open-ended nature of the commitment in Vietnam and the impossibility of achieving victory without mobilizing American society for total war. The request triggered intense debates within the administration between those who favored escalation and those who argued for negotiated settlement. Defense Secretary Clark Clifford, who had recently replaced Robert McNamara, conducted a comprehensive review of war strategy that concluded American objectives could not be achieved at acceptable cost. The review marked a turning point in official thinking about the war, acknowledging for the first time that military victory might be impossible regardless of the resources committed. Public opinion polls showed dramatic shifts in American attitudes toward the war following the Tet Offensive. Support for the conflict, which had already been declining gradually, dropped precipitously as images of urban fighting contradicted official claims of progress. The credibility gap between government statements and visible reality became an unbridgeable chasm that undermined trust in official pronouncements about all aspects of the war effort. Anti-war demonstrations grew larger and more militant as protesters pointed to the Tet, fighting as evidence that administration policies had failed completely. The offensive provided concrete examples of the war's futility that protest leaders could cite in their arguments for immediate withdrawal. University campuses became centers of increasingly radical opposition as students faced the prospect of being drafted to fight in a conflict that appeared to have no achievable objectives. The offensive also exposed the weakness of the South Vietnamese government and military forces that were supposedly being strengthened through American aid and training. Despite years of support, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam proved incapable of defending major urban areas without massive American assistance. The performance raised fundamental questions about the viability of the entire Vietnamization strategy that assumed South Vietnamese forces could eventually assume responsibility for their own defense. Political upheaval in the United States accelerated dramatically in the months following Tet, as the war's unpopularity combined with other social tensions to create unprecedented domestic turmoil. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April triggered riots in over 100 American cities, while student protests shut down universities across the country. The Democratic Party fractured as Senator Eugene McCarthy's anti-war candidacy challenged President Johnson's renomination, ultimately leading to Johnson's shocking announcement that he would not seek re-election. The My Lai massacre, which had occurred just weeks after the Tet Offensive began, emerged as a symbol of the war's moral corruption when details finally became public over a year later. The slaughter of civilians by American soldiers seemed to confirm critics' arguments that the conflict had brutalized participants on all sides and destroyed the moral foundations that had traditionally justified American military interventions abroad. International opinion also shifted decisively against the American war effort as allies questioned the wisdom of continuing a conflict that appeared to be causing more problems than it solved. European leaders, already skeptical of American policy in Southeast Asia, began publicly calling for negotiated settlement rather than military escalation. The isolation of American policy became increasingly apparent as former supporters distanced themselves from an enterprise that seemed to contradict basic principles of proportionality and effectiveness. The prisoner of war crisis intensified as increasing numbers of American airmen were shot down over North Vietnam and paraded before international media as evidence of American aggression. The treatment of these prisoners became an emotional rallying point for war supporters, who argued that withdrawal would abandon captured Americans to communist mercy. This argument complicated efforts to end American involvement by creating humanitarian obligations that transcended purely strategic considerations. By the end of 1968, it had become clear that the Tet Offensive had indeed marked a turning point in the Vietnam War, though not in the way that either side had initially anticipated. Communist forces had failed to achieve their immediate military and political objectives, but they had succeeded in demonstrating that no amount of American military power could guarantee victory in a conflict where the enemy was willing to accept unlimited casualties in pursuit of ultimate triumph. The offensive had transformed American public perception of the war from a limited engagement with achievable objectives into an open-ended commitment with no visible prospects for success. This shift in perception would prove irreversible, creating domestic political pressures that would eventually force American withdrawal regardless of battlefield developments. The war would continue for 7 more years, but the psychological victory that communist forces achieved during Tet had already determined its ultimate outcome. The television screen flickered with grainy black and white images as 19-year-old Susan Martinez sat cross-legged on the dormitory floor of Berkeley, watching body bags being loaded onto transport planes at Tan Son Nhut Airport. Her boyfriend Tommy had shipped out to Vietnam 3 months earlier, his letters growing shorter and more distant with each delivery. Around her, fellow students passed joints and argued about marks while the evening news painted Southeast Asia in shades of smoke and death that seemed impossibly distant from their California campus. This scene repeated itself in college dormitories across America as the generation that had grown up during the prosperous 1950s confronted a war that challenged everything their parents had taught them about duty, patriotism, and the righteousness of American power. The draft notices that arrived in campus mailboxes transformed abstract political debates into personal crises that forced young men to choose between military service, exile, or prison. The selective service system, designed during World War II when national unity made military service a shared obligation, proved ill-equipped to manage conscription during an unpopular war. Student deferments created a two-tiered system where college attendance became a form of class privilege that protected middle-class youth while working-class men bore the burden of combat duty. The inequity was stark. Sons of senators and corporate executives studying literature and philosophy, while sons of factory workers and farmers learned to kill and die in Asian jungles. Draft card burning ceremonies became theatrical demonstrations of resistance that captured media attention while expressing the profound moral revulsion many young Americans felt toward the war. The first public card burning occurred in New York City during October 1965, when David Miller ignited his selective service documents before a crowd of supporters and television cameras. The flames that consumed his card seemed to ignite a broader conflagration of rebellion that would consume the decade. The Underground Railroad that spirited draft resistors to Canada operated with the efficiency of the abolitionist networks that had once helped escaped slaves reach freedom. Churches, universities, and community organizations provided safe houses, legal advice, and transportation for young men who chose exile over military service. By war's end, an estimated 50,000 Americans had fled to Canada, creating expatriate communities in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal that would outlast the conflict itself. Folk music became the soundtrack of resistance as singers like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and Country Joe McDonald transformed protest into art that reached millions beyond the traditional boundaries of political activism. Dylan's "Blowin' in the Wind" posed questions that seemed to capture the war's essential absurdity, while Country Joe's "I Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die" rag used dark humor to mock the patriotic platitudes that justified sending teenagers to fight in an incomprehensible conflict. The teach-in movement that began at the University of Michigan in March 1965 created new forms of political education that challenged traditional academic boundaries between scholarship and activism. Professors who had maintained careful neutrality on political issues found themselves organizing all-night seminars where students and faculty explored the historical, cultural, and moral dimensions of American involvement in Southeast Asia. These gatherings spread to hundreds of campuses, creating networks of informed opposition that government officials found impossible to dismiss as communist-inspired. Women's liberation emerged partly from the contradictions within the anti-war movement itself, as female activists discovered that male leaders often relegated them to traditional support roles while claiming to fight for equality and justice in Vietnam. Organizations like Women Strike for Peace challenged both the war and the gender assumptions that excluded women from serious political decision-making. Their presence in demonstrations added moral authority to protests, while forcing broader questions about power and representation in American society. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago during August 1968 became a televised battleground where competing visions of American democracy clashed in Grant Park and the convention halls simultaneously. Mayor Richard Daley's police force attacked demonstrators with clubs and tear gas, while television cameras captured scenes that looked more like a police state than the land of the free. The violence in Chicago's streets paralleled the violence in Vietnam's jungles, creating a sense that America itself was tearing apart at the seams. Abby Hoffman and the Yippies brought guerrilla theater tactics to political protest, staging events designed to attract media attention while exposing the absurdities of conventional politics. Their nomination of a pig named Pegasus for president mocked the electoral process while highlighting the war's dehumanizing effects on both victims and perpetrators. The Yippie Festival of Life offered an alternative vision of American culture based on creativity, spontaneity, and rejection of the competitive materialism that seemed to drive the war machine. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower had warned against in his farewell address became a target of student activism as researchers uncovered university connections to weapons development and counterinsurgency research. Students for a Democratic Society organized campaigns against corporate recruiters from Dow Chemical, manufacturer of napalm, while occupying buildings where classified research supported the war effort. These actions forced universities to confront their complicity in what protesters saw as an immoral enterprise. The generation gap widened into a chasm as parents who remembered World War II's clear moral purposes struggled to understand their children's opposition to fighting communism in Southeast Asia. Dinner table arguments became proxy battles for larger cultural conflicts about authority, tradition, and the meaning of patriotism. Families fractured along political lines as sons refused induction notices and daughters joined protest movements that parents viewed as treasonous. Working-class Americans who sent their sons to Vietnam while college students demonstrated against the war developed deep resentment toward what they saw as privileged youth avoiding their patriotic duty. Hard hats who built skyscrapers and steelworkers who forged the materials of American prosperity organized counter-demonstrations supporting the war effort and attacking protesters as spoiled brats who took American freedom for granted. These class tensions would reshape American politics for decades to come. The underground press flourished as alternative newspapers like the Berkeley Barb, the Village Voice, and the Los Angeles Free Press provided information and analysis unavailable in mainstream media. These publications connected local protest movements with national organizations while offering perspectives that challenged official narratives about the war's progress and purposes. The FBI's surveillance and harassment of underground journalists demonstrated the government's concern about alternative sources of information. Religious leaders found themselves divided between traditional support for government authority and growing moral opposition to the war's conduct. The Vietnam conflict forced denominations to confront fundamental questions about just war theory, civil disobedience, and the relationship between faith and politics. Some clergy joined protest movements while others defended the war as necessary to contain atheistic communism, creating schisms within religious communities that paralleled broader social divisions. The Kent State shootings of May 4, 1970, marked the moment when the conflict in Southeast Asia finally came home to American soil with deadly finality. National Guard troops called to restore order after student protests against the invasion of Cambodia opened fire on unarmed demonstrators, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. The photographs of Jeffrey Miller lying dead on the campus walkway and Mary Ann Vecchio screaming over his body became iconic images that crystallized opposition to the war. Across the country, over 400 colleges and universities shut down as students organized strikes to protest both the Cambodian invasion and the Kent State killings. The academic year effectively ended as administrators canceled classes rather than risk further confrontations between students and authorities. For the first time in American history, domestic opposition to a foreign war had virtually paralyzed the nation's educational system. The Hard Hat riots in New York City demonstrated the depth of cultural divisions as construction workers attacked anti-war protesters with tools and fists, while police looked on with apparent approval. The violence reflected working-class anger at student protesters who seemed to reject everything that blue-collar Americans valued while enjoying privileges that workers' children could never afford. These confrontations preview the cultural politics that would dominate American elections for the rest of the century. Vietnam veterans against the war emerged as perhaps the most powerful voice of opposition, carrying moral authority that no other protest group could match. These men had fought in the jungles and rice paddies, earned Purple Hearts and Bronze Stars, yet returned home convinced that the war was fundamentally wrong. Their April 1971 demonstration in Washington, where hundreds of veterans threw their medals over a fence at the Capitol, provided television images that challenged traditional assumptions about patriotism and military service. John Kerry, a decorated Navy veteran who later became Secretary of State, testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee with eloquent fury about the war's moral bankruptcy. His question, "How do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake?" captured the essential tragedy of a conflict that leaders privately acknowledged could not be won but continued fighting to avoid admitting failure. Kerry's testimony helped legitimize opposition among Americans who had previously supported the war out of respect for soldiers in the field. The Pentagon Papers, leaked by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971, revealed the extent to which government officials had deceived the American people about the war's origins, conduct, and prospects for success. The classified documents showed that leaders had privately expressed doubts about the war's winnability while publicly proclaiming confidence in ultimate victory. The revelations destroyed whatever remained of public trust in official statements about the conflict. Drug culture and anti-war sentiment merged in ways that alarmed authorities who saw marijuana use as both symptom and cause of social breakdown. The counterculture that emerged around opposition to the war embraced mind-altering substances as tools of consciousness expansion that revealed the artificiality of conventional social arrangements. Government officials worried that drug use was undermining the work ethic and military discipline necessary to maintain American power in a dangerous world. The lottery system introduced in 1969 attempted to make conscription more fair by randomly assigning draft numbers based on birth dates, but it only intensified the war's psychological impact on young men. December 1st became known as the day the lottery was drawn, as millions of American families gathered around television sets to learn whether their sons would be called to serve. The random nature of selection added an element of cosmic unfairness to a war that already seemed to make no sense. Congressional opposition to the war grew as legislators faced increasing pressure from constituents who demanded explanations for a conflict that appeared to have no end. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, chaired by Arkansas Democrat J. William Fulbright, held televised hearings that allowed critics to present their arguments directly to the American people. These hearings provided a forum for debate that had been absent during the war's early years when bipartisan support silenced potential critics. The credibility gap that had opened during the Johnson administration widened under Nixon as officials continued to claim progress, while television images showed continued fighting and casualties. Public opinion polls showed steadily declining support for the war as Americans lost faith in their leaders' honesty and competence. The gap between official rhetoric and visible reality became so large that government statements about any aspect of the war were automatically viewed with suspicion. By 1971, American society had fractured along lines that would never fully heal. The war had destroyed the consensus that had sustained American foreign policy since World War II, while creating cultural divisions that would influence politics for generations. The home front had become a battlefield where fundamental questions about democracy, authority, and national purpose were fought with an intensity that matched the violence in Southeast Asia itself. The mahogany table in the Oval Office bore maps of Southeast Asia covered with colored pins marking American troop positions, enemy strongholds, and the invisible borders that separated one country's sovereignty from another's ambition. Richard Nixon traced his finger along the serpentine border between South Vietnam and Cambodia, where intelligence reports indicated massive North Vietnamese supply depots hidden beneath jungle canopies that had never known the footsteps of Western cartographers. It was January 1969, and the new president had inherited a war that was consuming American credibility, resources, and lives at rates that no democracy could sustain indefinitely. Nixon brought to the presidency a complex understanding of power politics that had been shaped by decades of foreign policy experience and a deep appreciation for the global chess game that defined Cold War competition. Unlike his predecessor, who had stumbled into Vietnam escalation through a series of incremental decisions, Nixon viewed the conflict as one element in a broader strategy designed to reshape America's relationship with both the Soviet Union and China. The war in Southeast Asia had become a test of American will that resonated far beyond the rice paddies and jungle clearings where soldiers fought and died. The concept that would become known as Vietnamization emerged from this strategic thinking, a policy designed to gradually transfer the burden of fighting from American forces to South Vietnamese troops, while maintaining sufficient military pressure to force a negotiated settlement on terms favorable to American interests. The strategy assumed that given adequate equipment, training, and air support, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam could eventually defend South Vietnam without large numbers of American ground troops. Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor and the architect of much of the administration's foreign policy, brought to these deliberations a European intellectual's perspective on balance of power diplomacy that viewed Vietnam as part of a global equilibrium that must be carefully maintained. Kissinger understood that American withdrawal from Southeast Asia would send signals to allies and adversaries around the world about American reliability and resolve. The challenge was to disengage from Vietnam without appearing to retreat in the face of communist pressure. The first test of this new approach came with the secret bombing of Cambodia, operations that began in March 1969 under the codename Menu, with individual missions bearing the names of American meals. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack, and dessert became the operational designations for airstrikes against North Vietnamese sanctuaries in neutral Cambodia, attacks that were hidden from Congress and the American people through an elaborate system of false reporting that transformed actual bombing coordinates into fictional targets inside South Vietnam. The B-52 Stratofortresses that carried out these missions flew from bases in Guam and Thailand, their crews believing they were striking legitimate military targets in South Vietnam until navigational corrections redirected them across international boundaries that existed on maps but meant nothing to the jungle canopy below. Each aircraft could carry up to 30 tons of conventional bombs, enough explosive power to create craters visible from satellite photographs and seismic disturbances detectable by monitoring stations thousands of miles away. The secrecy surrounding the Cambodian bombing reflected Nixon's belief that public disclosure would create domestic political problems that might undermine his broader strategy for ending the war. The administration feared that revealing attacks on a neutral country would trigger massive protests and congressional investigations that could paralyze American diplomacy. This deception created a precedent for presidential war-making that operated outside traditional constitutional constraints on executive power. Simultaneously, the administration began implementing the public face of Vietnamization through incremental reductions in American troop levels designed to demonstrate progress toward disengagement while maintaining military pressure on North Vietnamese forces. The first withdrawal of 25,000 troops was announced in June 1969, followed by additional reductions that brought American force levels down from over 540,000 to fewer than 160,000 by the end of 1971. Each withdrawal announcement was carefully choreographed to maximize political benefits while minimizing military risks, with units selected for redeployment based on their tactical importance and the symbolic value of their departure. The media covered these ceremonies with the same attention previously devoted to deployment departures, but the emotional tenor had changed from patriotic send-offs to weary homecomings that reflected the nation's exhaustion with a conflict that seemed to have no victorious conclusion. The Paris peace talks, which had begun during the final months of the Johnson administration, became the public forum where competing visions of Vietnam's future were debated in diplomatic language that obscured the fundamental incompatibility of the negotiating positions. North Vietnam demanded complete American withdrawal and the replacement of the Saigon government with a coalition that included the National Liberation Front, while the United States insisted on mutual withdrawal of all foreign forces and the preservation of South Vietnamese independence. The talks proceeded with glacial slowness as delegates argued about the shape of the conference table, the status of the National Liberation Front, and the definition of terms like aggression, liberation, and self-determination. Behind this procedural maneuvering lay deeper disagreements about the nature of the conflict itself, with North Vietnam viewing the war as a struggle for national reunification and the United States treating it as part of the global confrontation between democracy and communism. Kissinger's secret diplomacy operated parallel to these public negotiations, conducting private meetings with North Vietnamese representatives in Paris apartments and European capitals, where the real bargaining took place away from media scrutiny and domestic political pressures. These back-channel communications allowed both sides to explore possibilities that could not be discussed in formal sessions, but they also created confusion about American intentions and priorities that complicated the negotiating process. The invasion of Cambodia in April 1970 represented the most dramatic escalation of the war under Nixon's presidency, as American and South Vietnamese forces crossed international borders to attack North Vietnamese base camps that had been supplying the insurgency in South Vietnam for years. The operation, codenamed Rock Crusher, deployed over 30,000 troops in a 60-day campaign designed to capture weapons, destroy supply depots, and disrupt enemy operations throughout the region. Nixon's televised address announcing the Cambodian incursion portrayed the operation as necessary to protect American troops during the withdrawal process, but critics saw it as an expansion of the war that contradicted promises to reduce American involvement in Southeast Asia. The president's claim that America would not act like a pitiful, helpless giant resonated with supporters who had grown frustrated with the constraints that limited American military options, but it also triggered the largest wave of anti-war protests in the conflict's history. The domestic reaction to the Cambodian invasion demonstrated the extent to which the war had polarized American society and undermined public trust in presidential leadership. University campuses exploded in demonstrations that shut down classes at hundreds of institutions, while congressional critics accused the administration of conducting an illegal war without legislative authorization. The Kent state shootings, which occurred during this period of national upheaval, symbolized the domestic costs of a foreign policy that had divided Americans against themselves. The search for a decisive military victory that had eluded American forces throughout the conflict continued with the South Vietnamese invasion of Laos in February 1971, an operation designed to demonstrate the success of Vietnamization while cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail at its narrowest point. American forces provided helicopter transport, artillery support, and air cover, but South Vietnamese troops conducted the actual ground operations in accordance with congressional restrictions on American combat involvement in Laos. Operation Lam Son 719 quickly demonstrated the limitations of Vietnamization as South Vietnamese forces encountered stronger resistance than intelligence estimates had predicted and suffered heavy casualties that forced an earlier withdrawal than military planners had intended. Television footage of South Vietnamese soldiers clinging to the skids of American helicopters during the chaotic evacuation provided visual evidence that contradicted official claims about the improved capabilities of Allied forces. The failure in Laos raised fundamental questions about the viability of Vietnamization that extended beyond military capabilities to encompass political will, leadership quality, and national cohesion within South Vietnam. American advisors had spent years training South Vietnamese officers in modern military techniques, but they could not instill the motivation and unit cohesion that effective combat performance required. The cultural and social factors that influenced military effectiveness proved resistant to technological solutions. Domestic opposition to the war intensified as revelations about the My Lai massacre, the Pentagon Papers, and the secret bombing of Cambodia destroyed remaining public confidence in official statements about the conflict's conduct and objectives. Daniel Ellsberg's leak of classified documents revealed the extent to which government officials had deceived the American people about the war's origins and prospects, while court-martial proceedings against Lieutenant William Calley forced Americans to confront the moral costs of fighting an enemy that hid among civilians. The all-volunteer military that replaced conscription in 1973 reflected Nixon's understanding that draft resistance had become a major source of domestic opposition to the war. By eliminating the personal threat that conscription posed to middle-class families, the administration hoped to reduce anti-war sentiment while creating professional military forces that would be more effective in combat than reluctant draftees. The change also meant that future conflicts would be fought by soldiers who chose military service rather than citizens fulfilling a civic obligation. Détente with the Soviet Union and the opening to China provided the broader strategic context within which Nixon hoped to resolve the Vietnam conflict on terms that preserved American credibility while reducing the costs of global confrontation. The president's visit to Beijing in February 1972 and the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, signed with Moscow later that year, demonstrated that Cold War tensions could be managed through diplomatic engagement rather than military confrontation alone. These initiatives were designed partly to pressure North Vietnam by reducing its support from major communist powers who were developing their own interests in improved relations with the United States. The strategy assumed that Soviet and Chinese leaders would sacrifice their Vietnamese allies' objectives for the benefits of trade, technology transfer, and reduced nuclear tensions with America. This calculation proved partially correct, but underestimated North Vietnam's determination to achieve reunification regardless of great power preferences. The Easter Offensive of 1972 tested both Vietnamization and American resolve as North Vietnamese forces launched their largest conventional assault since the Tet Offensive 4 years earlier. Unlike the urban attacks of 1968, this campaign employed tanks, heavy artillery, and massed infantry formations in operations that resembled World War II battles more than guerrilla warfare. The offensive aimed to demonstrate that South Vietnamese forces could not defend their country without massive American support. The American response, Operation Linebacker, represented the most intensive bombing campaign since the World War II attacks on Germany and Japan, with B-52 strikes against strategic targets throughout North Vietnam, including the previously off-limits areas around Hanoi and Haiphong. The bombing was designed to force North Vietnam back to serious negotiations while demonstrating that American disengagement did not mean abandonment of South Vietnamese allies. The Christmas bombings of 1972, officially known as Linebacker 2, brought the war to its most destructive climax as American aircraft struck targets throughout North Vietnam during an 11-day campaign that dropped more explosives than had been used in the entire Pacific Theater during World War II. The operation was designed to force final concessions in the Paris negotiations, but it also triggered international condemnation and renewed domestic protests that limited its duration and political effectiveness. The Paris Peace Accords, signed on January 27, 1973, represented a compromise that allowed both sides to claim victory while postponing the fundamental issues that had caused the conflict. The agreement provided for American withdrawal, the return of prisoners of war, and a ceasefire that would supposedly allow South Vietnam to determine its own future through peaceful political processes. In reality, the accords legitimized continued North Vietnamese military presence in South Vietnam while removing the American forces that had prevented communist victory. Nixon's promise of peace with honor masked the reality that the United States was accepting a military stalemate that left South Vietnam vulnerable to future attack. The president assured South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu that America would respond with force to any major North Vietnamese violations of the ceasefire, but domestic political constraints made such intervention increasingly unlikely as Watergate scandal consumed the administration's attention and credibility. The final American combat troops departed South Vietnam on March 29, 1973. Ending direct American military involvement in a conflict that had lasted over a decade and cost 58,000 American lives. The departure ceremonies lacked the triumphant atmosphere that had marked the end of previous American wars, reflecting the ambiguous nature of an outcome that preserved South Vietnamese independence temporarily while acknowledging that ultimate resolution remained uncertain. The telex machine in the American embassy chattered incessantly through the humid night of April 29, 1975, its mechanical rhythm punctuated by the distant rumble of artillery that grew closer with each passing hour. Ambassador Graham Martin sat in his office surrounded by stacks of classified documents that would soon become trophies for the victorious North Vietnamese forces converging on Saigon from 3 directions. The smell of burning paper drifted through the embassy corridors as staff members fed sensitive files into incinerators that glowed like funeral pyres for America's longest war. 2 years had passed since the last American combat troops departed South Vietnam under the terms of the Paris Peace Accords, leaving behind a fragile ceasefire that both sides had violated almost immediately. The promised peace had never materialized, replaced instead by a slow-motion collapse that accelerated with each passing month as North Vietnamese forces rebuilt their strength while South Vietnamese morale disintegrated like sugar in monsoon rain. President Nguyen Van Thieu, who had ruled South Vietnam since 1967, presided over a government that existed primarily on paper and in the air-conditioned offices of Saigon's administrative district. Beyond the capital's concrete barriers and sandbag fortifications, large portions of the countryside had reverted to communist control through a combination of military pressure and political organization that made a mockery of ceasefire agreements. Villages that had changed hands multiple times during the war's peak years now flew the gold-starred flag of North Vietnam without fear of retaliation. The economic crisis that gripped South Vietnam reflected deeper structural problems that American aid had masked but never solved. Corruption permeated every level of government and military leadership, with officials more concerned about personal enrichment than national defense. Officers sold weapons and ammunition to the enemy they were supposed to fight, while government contracts became vehicles for transferring American aid into private bank accounts in Switzerland and Hong Kong. The military imbalance that emerged after American withdrawal was as much psychological as material, though the North Vietnamese advantages in both categories were overwhelming. Hanoi's forces had used the ceasefire period to construct all-weather roads through Laos and Cambodia, enabling them to move tanks, artillery, and supply convoys with an efficiency that transformed their strategic capabilities. The Ho Chi Minh Trail had evolved from a network of jungle paths into a modern logistics system that could support conventional military operations. Meanwhile, South Vietnamese forces suffered from declining morale, inadequate supplies, and leadership that had grown accustomed to American decision-making and support. Without American advisors to provide tactical guidance and American aircraft to deliver firepower, ARVN units discovered that their training had not prepared them for independent operations against an enemy that had never stopped learning and adapting. The final offensive began in December 1974 with attacks against isolated government outposts in the Central Highlands, probing operations designed to test South Vietnamese resolve and American willingness to intervene. When these attacks met only token resistance and no American response, North Vietnamese commanders realized that the moment for decisive action had arrived. General Van Tien Dung, who had replaced the legendary Von Nguyen Giap as North Vietnam's top military strategist, ordered the preparation of plans for a campaign that would end the war within 2 years. The fall of Phuoc Long Province in January 1975 provided the first clear indication that South Vietnam's end was approaching faster than anyone had anticipated. The provincial capital fell without significant resistance, and more importantly, without any American retaliation despite Nixon's earlier promises to respond forcefully to major ceasefire violations. President Gerald Ford, who had inherited the Vietnam burden along with the Watergate scandal when Nixon resigned, found himself constrained by congressional restrictions on military action and public opinion that had turned decisively against further involvement in Southeast Asia. The Ban Me Thuot offensive in March marked the beginning of the end for South Vietnam as a functioning state. The Central Highlands city fell to North Vietnamese forces in a lightning campaign that demonstrated the complete transformation of communist military capabilities since the guerrilla warfare days of the 1960s. Tank columns supported by artillery and helicopter gunships advanced with a coordination and speed that shocked South Vietnamese commanders who had grown complacent during the ceasefire years. President Thie's decision to abandon the Central Highlands and concentrate his remaining forces around Saigon and the Mekong Delta triggered a cascade of military and civilian panic that accelerated the regime's collapse. The strategic withdrawal, codenamed Operation Frequent Wind, was supposed to be an orderly redeployment that would shorten defensive lines and preserve South Vietnam's most important population centers. Instead, it became a chaotic retreat that left entire provinces defenseless and created streams of refugees that clogged roads and overwhelmed transportation systems. The sight of South Vietnamese soldiers discarding their uniforms and weapons while fleeing alongside civilian refugees destroyed whatever remained of public confidence in the government's ability to provide security. Military units that had fought effectively when supported by American firepower disintegrated when faced with the prospect of fighting alone against an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited reserves of men and equipment. Hue fell on March 26th after token resistance that lasted less than 2 days, a shocking contrast to the 25-day battle that had raged through the ancient capital during the Tet Offensive 7 years earlier. The imperial city that had witnessed centuries of Vietnamese history passed into communist hands with barely a shot fired, its capture symbolizing the complete reversal of military fortunes since American withdrawal. Da Nang, South Vietnam's second-largest city and a major military base throughout the American war years, fell on March 30th in scenes of chaos that previewed the final collapse in Saigon. Thousands of soldiers and civilians fought for space on aircraft and ships leaving the city, while those left behind faced an uncertain fate under the new regime. Television cameras captured images of desperate people clinging to the landing gear of departing aircraft, visual metaphors for a nation abandoning those who had trusted in American promises of protection. The speed of South Vietnamese collapse surprised even North Vietnamese commanders, who had planned for a longer campaign that would culminate with the capture of Saigon during the following year's dry season. Instead, they found themselves racing to exploit opportunities created by enemy disintegration while trying to maintain command and control over units that were advancing faster than supply lines could support them. As communist forces closed in on Saigon during the final weeks of April, the city took on a surreal atmosphere that combined desperate revelry with fatalistic resignation. Nightclubs and restaurants remained open while artillery shells landed in the suburbs, creating a carnival atmosphere among those who could afford to ignore the approaching catastrophe. The black market in exit visas, American dollars, and airplane tickets flourished as those with connections or money sought escape routes before the communist victory became complete. The evacuation of American personnel and South Vietnamese allies presented logistical and political challenges that no amount of planning could have fully addressed. Operation Frequent Wind, the helicopter evacuation from the embassy roof and other designated sites throughout Saigon, was designed to remove 1,800 Americans and 6,000 South Vietnamese during an 18-hour period beginning on April 29th. The operation's reality proved far more chaotic than its planners had envisioned, as thousands of Vietnamese who had worked with Americans during the war years pressed against embassy gates seeking evacuation that had been promised but could not be delivered to everyone who deserved it. Marine Guards found themselves in the impossible position of selecting who would be saved and who would be left behind to face retribution from the victorious communist forces. The iconic photograph of CIA Station Chief Tom Polgar burning classified documents on the embassy roof while helicopters waited to ferry evacuees to aircraft carriers offshore became one of the war's most enduring images. The scene captured both the end of American involvement and the abandonment of allies who had trusted American promises of protection, creating a visual symbol that would haunt American foreign policy for decades to come. Ambassador Martin's reluctance to begin the evacuation until the last possible moment reflected both his personal attachment to South Vietnam and his hope that some last-minute diplomatic solution might prevent total communist victory. His delay in authorizing the helicopter lifts meant that many Vietnamese who had expected to be evacuated were left behind when security considerations forced the suspension of operations, with hundreds of people still waiting outside embassy walls. The final helicopter departed from the embassy roof at 7:53 a.m. on April 30th, carrying Ambassador Martin and the last American officials to leave South Vietnam. The CH-53 Sea Stallion rose into the morning sky over a city where North Vietnamese tanks were already entering the outskirts, their crews racing to reach the presidential palace before organized resistance could be mounted. President Thieu had fled the country on April 21st, taking with him several tons of gold and leaving behind a bitter farewell speech that blamed the United States for South Vietnam's collapse. His departure created a power vacuum that his successors, first Vice President Tran Van Huong and then General Duong Van Minh, could not fill during the final chaotic days of the regime's existence. The image of North Vietnamese tanks crashing through the gates of the presidential palace at 11:30 a.m. on April 30th became the war's definitive ending, a visual punctuation mark that closed a chapter of Vietnamese history that had lasted for over 30 years. Colonel Bui Tin, the North Vietnamese officer who accepted the surrender of the last South Vietnamese government, reportedly told General Minh that there was nothing to surrender since the communist forces had already achieved complete victory. The fall of Saigon marked not just the end of South Vietnam as a political entity, but the conclusion of the longest and most controversial war in American history. The helicopter evacuations from the embassy roof provided imagery that would define American memories of the conflict, scenes of desperate flight that seemed to symbolize the futility of a struggle that had consumed over 58,000 American lives and cost hundreds of billions of dollars without achieving its stated objectives. For the Vietnamese people, both North and South, the communist victory represented the beginning of a new phase of their national experience, rather than the end of their struggles. Reunification would bring its own challenges as the victorious regime attempted to integrate two regions with different economic systems, social structures, and relationships with the outside world. The war's end marked the beginning of peace, but not necessarily the beginning of prosperity or freedom for all Vietnamese. The boat people crisis that followed communist victory demonstrated that military triumph did not automatically translate into political legitimacy or economic success. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese, including many who had never worked directly with Americans, chose exile over life under the new regime, creating refugee flows that would continue for decades and test the humanitarian commitments of nations that had supported the losing side in the war. As the sun set on April 30th, 1975, over a city that would soon be renamed Ho Chi Minh City, the Vietnam War had finally ended with the complete victory of the forces that had been fighting for independence and reunification since the 1940s. The cost of that victory, measured in lives lost, families separated, and societies traumatized, would influence Vietnamese development for generations while reshaping American foreign policy in ways that continue to resonate in the 21st century. The silence that descended over the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta in May 1975 was unlike anything the region had experienced in over 3 decades. No helicopter rotors chopped through the humid air, no artillery thundered across the horizon, no jets screamed overhead trailing contrails of destruction. For the first time since the Japanese occupation during World War II, Vietnam was truly at peace, unified under a single government that controlled territory from the Chinese border to the South China Sea. Yet this peace came weighted with consequences that would shape the nation's destiny for generations. In the former Saigon, now renamed Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the revolutionary leader who had died 6 years before witnessing his dream of reunification, communist cadres began the complex task of transforming a capitalist enclave into a socialist society. The bustling commercial center that had thrived on American dollars and black market commerce faced a radical restructuring that would eliminate private enterprise, nationalize foreign businesses, and integrate the southern economy into the centrally planned system that had governed North Vietnam since 1954. The new government's first priority was consolidating military victory into political control, a process that required dismantling the elaborate intelligence networks, military structures, and administrative systems that had supported the defeated Republic of Vietnam. Thousands of former South Vietnamese officials, military officers, and police personnel were ordered to report to re-education camps for political indoctrination and manual labor that was supposed to transform enemies of the revolution into productive citizens of the unified socialist state. These camps, scattered throughout the mountainous regions of northern and central Vietnam, became holding facilities for anyone the new regime considered politically unreliable. Former soldiers who had fought against communist forces, intellectuals who had been educated in the West, businessmen who had profited from the wartime economy, and religious leaders who might challenge the government's authority found themselves subjected to years of detention under conditions that ranged from harsh to brutal, depending on their perceived threat to state security. Le Duan, the Communist Party leader who had succeeded Ho Chi Minh as the real power in North Vietnam, pursued reunification policies that prioritized rapid socialist transformation over gradual integration of the two regions' different economic and social systems. The decision to impose northern-style collectivization on the individualistic farmers of the Mekong Delta created resistance that persisted for years, while the nationalization of southern businesses eliminated entrepreneurial traditions that had made the region prosperous. The human cost of reunification became apparent as hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese concluded that life under communist rule was preferable to exile in the uncertain waters of the South China Sea. The boat people phenomenon that began as a trickle in 1975 became a flood by the late 1970s, as ethnic Chinese merchants faced discriminatory policies and former military personnel discovered that re-education was often indefinite detention rather than temporary reform. The overcrowded fishing boats and hastily constructed rafts that carried these refugees into international waters became floating symbols of the new regime's failures to create a society that Vietnamese people wanted to inhabit. Families sold everything they owned to purchase space on vessels that were often unseaworthy, gambling their lives on the possibility that foreign countries would accept them as refugees rather than return them to face punishment for illegal departure. The international response to this humanitarian crisis revealed the complex legacy of the Vietnam War in global politics. Countries that had supported South Vietnam during the conflict felt moral obligations to accept refugees, but domestic political considerations limited their willingness to absorb large numbers of Asian immigrants. The United States, despite its role in creating the conditions that generated the refugee flows, initially resisted large-scale resettlement programs that might remind Americans of their failed involvement in Southeast Asia. Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and other Southeast Asian nations found themselves hosting refugee camps that grew into permanent settlements as the international community struggled to find third-country destinations for people who could not safely return home. The camps became breeding grounds for political organization among Vietnamese exiles who dreamed of eventually overthrowing the communist government and returning to reclaim their homeland. The environmental devastation that became visible after the war's end shocked even observers who had witnessed the conflict's destructive power firsthand. Agent Orange and other chemical defoliants had stripped forests bare across millions of acres, creating moonscapes where tropical vegetation had once thrived. The chemicals' persistence in soil and water supplies meant that their effects would continue for decades, causing birth defects and health problems that affected multiple generations of Vietnamese families. Unexploded ordnance posed an even more immediate threat to post-war recovery efforts, as millions of bombs, artillery shells, and landmines remained scattered throughout the countryside, waiting to kill or maim farmers, children, and anyone else unlucky enough to disturb them. The United States had dropped more explosives on Vietnam than it had used in all of World War II, and a significant percentage had failed to detonate on impact, creating a deadly legacy that would claim thousands of additional lives long after the fighting ended. Dr. Nguyen Thi Ngoc Phuong, a pediatrician working in Ho Chi Minh City's Children's Hospital, documented birth defects that appeared to be linked to parental exposure to chemical defoliants during the war years. Her research, conducted without access to modern laboratory equipment or international medical databases, suggested that Agent Orange was causing chromosomal damage that would affect Vietnamese children for generations. The American government's refusal to acknowledge these health effects or provide compensation for victims became a source of lasting resentment. The economic reconstruction that Vietnam's new leaders had expected to follow military victory proved far more difficult than political consolidation. The war had destroyed much of the country's infrastructure while creating an economy dependent on foreign aid and military spending that disappeared with American withdrawal. The challenge of transforming this artificial wartime system into a productive peacetime economy was complicated by international isolation that limited access to the technology and investment needed for development. The Soviets, who had provided military aid during the war, proved reluctant to finance large-scale economic development in peacetime, particularly as their own economy began showing signs of the stagnation that would eventually contribute to the communist system's collapse. China, Vietnam's northern neighbor and traditional rival, actively opposed Vietnamese regional ambitions while supporting the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia that had begun massacring ethnic Vietnamese civilians. The invasion of Cambodia in December 1978 launched to overthrow the genocidal Khmer Rouge government that had been killing Vietnamese minorities and launching cross-border raids, demonstrated Vietnam's military capabilities, but also its international isolation. The operation succeeded in toppling Pol Pot's regime and ending one of the 20th century's worst genocides, but it also triggered Chinese retaliation and further isolation from the international community. The brief but intense war with China in February and March 1979 showed that Vietnam's military victories over France and the United States had not guaranteed security against all potential threats. Chinese forces invaded across the northern border in what Beijing called a punitive expedition designed to teach Vietnam a lesson about respecting Chinese interests in Southeast Asia. The fighting demonstrated Vietnamese military effectiveness in defensive operations while revealing the limits of Soviet support for their Southeast Asian ally. The agricultural collectivization programs that the government imposed on southern farmers proved to be economic disasters that reduced food production and created widespread malnutrition in a region that had traditionally been Vietnam's Rice Bowl. Peasants who had owned their land for generations found themselves working on collective farms where individual initiative was discouraged and productivity declined dramatically. The policy failures forced the government to retreat from doctrinaire socialism and begin experimenting with market mechanisms years before similar reforms began in China and the Soviet Union. The exodus of ethnic Chinese from Vietnam during the late 1970s eliminated much of the commercial expertise that had made the southern economy function effectively. These Hoa people, who had operated businesses ranging from small shops to major import-export firms, took with them capital, connections, and entrepreneurial knowledge that the communist government could not easily replace. Their departure contributed to the economic stagnation that characterized Vietnam throughout the 1980s. The missing in action issue that complicated Vietnamese-American relations for decades reflected the war's unfinished business and the domestic political constraints that limited both governments' flexibility in addressing humanitarian concerns. Families of American servicemen who had been shot down or captured wanted accounting for their loved ones' fates, while the Vietnamese government used this leverage to seek normalization of relations and removal of the economic embargo that limited its access to international markets. Joint search teams that began operating in the 1980s represented one of the few areas of cooperation between former enemies, as American and Vietnamese specialists worked together to locate crash sites and recover remains that could provide closure for families on both sides. These missions revealed the extent of wartime destruction while demonstrating that technical cooperation was possible even when broader political reconciliation remained elusive. The development of war tourism during the 1990s created a peculiar form of reconciliation as American veterans returned to visit battlefields where they had fought decades earlier. The Cu Chi tunnels became a popular destination for tourists who could crawl through the underground complexes that had sheltered Viet Cong fighters, while the former demilitarized zone attracted visitors interested in seeing the physical remnants of the war's most heavily fortified frontier. These visits often produced emotional encounters between former enemies who discovered shared humanity beneath the ideological differences that had divided them during the conflict. American veterans met with North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters who had been trying to kill them years earlier, finding common ground in their experiences of combat, loss, and survival that transcended political boundaries. The gradual economic liberalization that began with the Doi Moi reforms of 1986 represented a practical acknowledgement that socialist economics could not deliver the prosperity that Vietnamese people deserved after decades of warfare and deprivation. The introduction of market mechanisms, private property rights, and foreign investment opportunities transformed Vietnam from one of Asia's poorest countries into a rapidly growing economy that attracted international attention. The normalization of relations with the United States in 1995 closed a 20-year chapter of mutual hostility while opening possibilities for cooperation that neither side had imagined during the war years. American companies that had once manufactured weapons for use against Vietnamese forces began investing in factories and infrastructure projects that employed thousands of Vietnamese workers, creating economic relationships that served both nations' interests. The younger generation of Vietnamese who had no personal memories of the war embraced globalization and modernization with enthusiasm that sometimes puzzled their elders, who remembered the costs of foreign involvement. Internet cafes and fast food restaurants appeared in cities where American soldiers had once fought house-to-house battles, while Vietnamese students studied English and business administration in preparation for careers in the global economy. Yet beneath this surface modernization, the war's legacy continued to influence Vietnamese society in subtle but profound ways. Environmental damage from chemical warfare persisted in rural areas where farmers still discovered unexploded ordnance in their fields. The authoritarian political system that had been necessary for wartime mobilization proved resistant to democratization even as economic liberalization proceeded. The generation that had led the independence struggle maintained political control, while younger Vietnamese who might favor greater openness found few avenues for peaceful political expression. As the 21st century began, Vietnam faced the challenge of balancing rapid economic development with environmental protection, political stability with individual freedom, and national sovereignty with international integration. The war that had once defined the country's relationship with the world had become historical memory, but its consequences continued to shape Vietnamese choices in ways that would influence the nation's development for decades to come. The black granite wall stretched across the Washington Mall like a scar in the earth, its polished surface reflecting the faces of visitors who came to trace the names of friends, brothers, fathers, and lovers who had died in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, dedicated in November 1982, became a pilgrimage site for a nation still struggling to understand the meaning of its longest and most divisive war. Each of the 58,318 names etched into the stone represented not just an individual tragedy, but a collective wound that would influence American foreign policy and national identity for generations. The memorial's designer, Maya Lin, had envisioned a place of healing rather than celebration, understanding intuitively that this war required a different kind of remembrance than the triumphant monuments that commemorated America's victories in previous conflicts. The wall's stark simplicity forced visitors to confront the human cost of the war without the heroic imagery that might obscure its painful lessons about the limits of military power and the complexity of international intervention. The syndrome that bore the war's name entered American political discourse during the late 1970s as analysts struggled to explain the nation's reluctance to use military force in international crises. The Vietnam Syndrome represented more than simple war weariness. It reflected a fundamental shift in American attitudes toward overseas commitments and the assumption of global responsibilities that had defined foreign policy since World War II. The confidence that had once made America willing to bear any burden and pay any price in defense of freedom had been shattered by the realization that good intentions and superior technology could not guarantee successful outcomes in complex political conflicts. President Ronald Reagan, who took office in 1981, promising to restore American strength and prestige, explicitly sought to overcome the Vietnam Syndrome through military interventions designed to demonstrate that American power could still achieve decisive victories. The invasion of Grenada in 1983, a brief operation against a tiny Caribbean island, was carefully planned to avoid the ambiguous objectives and gradualist escalation that had characterized the Vietnam involvement. The overwhelming success of this limited intervention suggested that Americans would support military action when objectives were clear and achievable. The Iran hostage crisis that had paralyzed the Carter administration demonstrated how the Vietnam experience influenced American responses to international challenges that required sustained commitment and acceptance of risk. The images of American diplomats held captive in Tehran for 444 days evoked memories of American impotence in Southeast Asia, while the failed rescue mission that ended in disaster at Desert One seemed to confirm that American military capabilities had been degraded by the trauma of defeat in Vietnam. The development of the Powell Doctrine during the 1980s represented a systematic attempt to apply Vietnam's lessons to future military interventions by establishing criteria that would prevent American forces from becoming trapped in unwinnable conflicts. General Colin Powell, who had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a young officer, argued that military force should be used only when vital national interests were at stake, when clear political objectives could be achieved through military means, when overwhelming force could be applied to ensure rapid victory, and when public support existed for the duration of the conflict. The Persian Gulf War of 1991 became the first major test of these principles, as President George H.W. Bush assembled an international coalition to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait through a campaign that deliberately avoided the mistakes that had led to failure in Vietnam. The operation featured clear objectives, overwhelming force, broad international support, and a rapid conclusion that achieved its political goals without becoming mired in nation-building or counterinsurgency operations. The televised coverage of precision-guided weapons destroying their targets with minimal civilian casualties provided visual evidence that American military technology had advanced dramatically since the Vietnam era, while the rapid liberation of Kuwait demonstrated that American forces could still achieve decisive victories when properly employed. The success helped restore confidence in American military capabilities while validating the lessons that defense analysts had drawn from the Vietnam experience. Yet the celebration of victory in the Persian Gulf revealed the extent to which Vietnam continued to influence American strategic thinking, as political leaders emphasized that this conflict would not become another Vietnam, implicitly acknowledging that the earlier war remained the standard against which military interventions would be measured. The determination to avoid prolonged occupation or complex political reconstruction reflected hard-won wisdom about the limits of military solutions to political problems. The intervention in Somalia during the early 1990s demonstrated how quickly public support could evaporate when military operations exceeded their original humanitarian objectives and began producing American casualties without clear strategic gains. The images of American soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu in October 1993 triggered immediate comparisons to Vietnam and led to rapid withdrawal from a mission that had begun with broad public support for feeding starving populations. The Rwanda genocide of 1994, in which 800,000 people were murdered while the international community failed to intervene effectively, illustrated how the Vietnam syndrome could prevent necessary humanitarian action when the memory of past failures created excessive caution about military involvement. The Clinton administration's reluctance to authorize intervention reflected not just practical concerns about military effectiveness, but also political calculations about public tolerance for casualties in conflicts that did not directly threaten American interests. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that began after the September 11, 2001 attacks provided the most comprehensive test of Vietnam's lessons for a new generation of American leaders and military commanders. The initial invasions achieved rapid military victories that seemed to validate advances in technology and doctrine, but the subsequent occupations and nation-building efforts revealed the persistence of challenges that had frustrated American forces in Southeast Asia decades earlier. The insurgencies that emerged in both countries employed tactics similar to those that had proven effective against American forces in Vietnam, including improvised explosive devices, suicide attacks, and the ability to blend into civilian populations while conducting operations against government and coalition forces. The enemy's willingness to accept unlimited casualties while fighting for objectives they considered vital contrasted sharply with American public expectations of rapid, decisive victory with minimal friendly losses. The debate over counterinsurgency doctrine that dominated American military thinking during the 2000 period explicitly referenced Vietnam as both a source of lessons about effective tactics and a cautionary tale about the dangers of mission creep and unclear objectives. General David Petraeus, who led the surge strategy in Iraq, had written his doctoral dissertation on the Vietnam War's lessons for American military intervention, arguing that success required not just military operations, but comprehensive political and economic programs designed to win popular support. The development of new technologies for surveillance, precision strikes, and real-time intelligence seemed to offer solutions to problems that had frustrated commanders in Vietnam. But the fundamental challenge of distinguishing between combatants and civilians in guerrilla warfare remained as difficult as ever. Drone strikes and special operations raids could eliminate specific targets with unprecedented accuracy, but they could not resolve the political grievances that motivated insurgent movements or create legitimate governments that populations would accept. The cultural legacy of the Vietnam War permeated American society through literature, film, and music that explored themes of alienation, betrayal, and moral ambiguity that resonated far beyond the specific historical experience of the conflict. Movies like Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and Full Metal Jacket became part of the national imagination, shaping perceptions of war itself while providing metaphors for understanding other conflicts and social problems. The stereotype of the troubled Vietnam veteran became a fixture in American popular culture, often overshadowing the reality that most veterans had successfully readjusted to civilian life despite the challenges they faced upon returning from an unpopular war. The image of the psychologically damaged veteran struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, and social isolation reflected genuine problems that affected significant numbers of returnees, but it also created stigmas that complicated efforts to address veterans' needs. The Agent Orange litigation that stretched across decades revealed how the war's consequences continued to affect veterans and their families long after the fighting ended. The class action lawsuit against chemical manufacturers resulted in a settlement that provided compensation for some health problems linked to herbicide exposure, but it also highlighted the difficulties of proving causation for diseases that might have multiple contributing factors and the challenges of providing adequate care for veterans suffering from service-connected disabilities. The evolution of the Department of Veterans Affairs from a bureaucratic backwater into one of the federal government's largest agencies reflected both the scale of need created by the Vietnam War and the broader transformation of American attitudes toward military service and veterans' benefits. The expansion of educational benefits, healthcare programs, and disability compensation represented an acknowledgement that society owed special obligations to those who had served in combat, even in an unpopular war. The anti-war movement's legacy influenced subsequent protest movements and political activism, providing organizational models and tactical approaches that were adapted for struggles over civil rights, women's liberation, environmental protection, and other social issues. The techniques of mass mobilization, media manipulation, and civil disobedience that had been developed during the Vietnam era became standard elements of American political discourse, democratizing dissent while creating new forms of civic engagement. The credibility gap that emerged during the Vietnam War fundamentally altered the relationship between American citizens and their government, creating skepticism about official statements and policies that would influence public responses to subsequent crises. The revelation that government officials had systematically deceived the public about the war's progress and prospects created expectations of deception that made it more difficult for future leaders to build consensus for international commitments requiring sustained public support. The Pentagon Papers case established important precedents for press freedom and the public's right to know about government activities, but it also demonstrated the tensions between national security requirements and democratic accountability that would resurface during later conflicts. The principle that the press had a right and duty to publish classified information that revealed government misconduct became a foundation for investigative journalism, but it also created ongoing debates about the boundaries of legitimate secrecy in a democratic society. The transformation of the military from a conscript force to an all-volunteer professional army represented one of the war's most significant institutional legacies, creating armed forces that were more skilled and motivated, but also more socially isolated from the civilian population they served. The elimination of the draft removed a major source of domestic opposition to military interventions, while creating a warrior class that bore the burden of America's overseas commitments without the broader social participation that had characterized previous conflicts. The diplomatic revolution that brought former enemies into partnership demonstrated the possibility of reconciliation even after bitter conflicts, providing models for peace processes in other regions while highlighting the importance of economic incentives in transforming international relationships. The normalization of relations between the United States and Vietnam proved that ideological differences need not prevent practical cooperation when both sides possessed sufficient political will and mutual interests. As the 21st century progressed, the Vietnam War's lessons continued to influence American foreign policy debates, with different factions drawing different conclusions from the same historical experience. Liberals argued that the war demonstrated the futility of military solutions to political problems and the importance of international law and multilateral cooperation, while conservatives contended that the failure resulted from insufficient commitment and excessive restrictions on military operations rather than flawed strategic assumptions. The 50th anniversary commemorations that began in 2012 reflected a mature democracy's ability to acknowledge past mistakes while honoring the sacrifice of those who had served their country in difficult circumstances. The ceremonies struck a balance between recognizing the war's costs and failures while affirming respect for veterans who had answered their nation's call regardless of the wisdom of the policies they had been asked to implement. The Vietnam War was not just fought in the jungles of Asia, but in the conscience of the world, challenging assumptions about power, progress, and the relationship between military force and political objectives that continue to shape international relations in an era of global terrorism, humanitarian intervention, and asymmetric warfare. The questions it raised about the limits of American power, the nature of legitimate authority, and the moral responsibilities of democratic societies remain as relevant today as they were during the turbulent decade when a small Southeast Asian nation forced the world's most powerful country to confront the boundaries of its own strength and the complexity of human aspirations for freedom, dignity, and self-determination.